Hello and welcome to this webinar on enhancing opportunities to increase and support the inclusion of underrepresented minority populations. I'm Sarah Ramaya, Curriculum Design Specialist at ASRM. Our moderator for this webinar is Dr. Michael Thomas. Dr. Thomas is Professor and Chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. He's been named one of the best doctors in America for 22 consecutive years, an honor bestowed on 4% of physicians in the United States. He graduated from the University of Illinois College of Medicine and was a resident at Wayne State University in Detroit. Dr. Thomas completed a fellowship in REI at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and is board certified in both obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility. He is chair of the ASRM DEI Task Force and vice president of ASRM. In addition, he's a board member at the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Before we begin, please note, this webinar was developed by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine as an educational resource and service to its members and other reproductive professionals. While this webinar reflects the views of the panelists, it is not intended to be the only approved standard of practice or to dictate an exclusive course of treatment. Members should always use their best judgment in determining a course of action and be guided by the needs of the individual patient, available resources, and institutional or clinical practice limitations. All attendees will be muted except the presenters. Time at the end of the presentation will be reserved for questions. Please type a question in the question window at any time. We will read as many selected questions as possible to the presenters during the allotted question and answer time. A recording of this webinar will be archived on the ASRM website in the coming weeks. Please watch your email for notification. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Thomas to introduce today's speakers and moderate the session. None of the speakers have any disclosures.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. We appreciate you coming to the second part of our presentation webinar on and entitled Enhancing Opportunities to Increase and Support the Inclusion of Underrepresented Minority Populations. Our panelists tonight are Michelle Vu, Michael Simoni, Gloria Richard-Davis, T. Arthur Chang, and Christopher Herndon. Our first two speakers will be our resident and fellow, Dr. Michelle Vu, who will be given a resident perspective about enhancing opportunities. Dr. Vu is a OBGYN resident at the University of Rochester Medical Center. She graduated from the University of Illinois College of Medicine, where I graduated from. She is passionate about diversifying resident education and cultivating new opportunities for her peers in the field of REI. And then after her will be Dr. Michael Simoni, who will give an REI fellow perspective. Dr. Simoni is a second-year clinical fellow in reproductive endocrinology and infertility at Penn Fertility Care in the University of Pennsylvania. He's a member of the ASRM Podcast Task Force and producer of ASRM's podcast, FNS On Air. Dr. Simoni has led multiple community service initiatives in underserved communities throughout his academic and medical career, including reproductive health fairs and STEM programs in grade schools. First up is Dr. Michelle Vu. Dr. Vu.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and thank you, Dr. Thomas, for the introduction. As Dr. Thomas has said, my name is Michelle Vu, and I'm currently an OB-GYN intern at the University of Rochester. I was asked to share my personal experience as a URM OB-GYN resident, hoping to one day become an REI physician. I actually didn't make any slides just because I wanted to keep this really raw and kind of just share my own personal experience. I remember not knowing that the field of REI even existed within the OB-GYN specialty until my REI rotation in medical school. I find this funny because even now when I tell medical students or residents in other specialties that I'm interested in REI, I'm always met with puzzled looks. Often I'm asked, REI, like the camping store? Thus, I wanted to point out one of the first barriers to increasing URMs in reproductive medicine, the lack of early REI exposure. This applies not only to medical students, but also to OB-GYN residents. In general, most OB-GYN residency programs typically only have one REI rotation built into the curriculum during the PGY2 or PGY3 years. This provides relatively late and little exposure to the field. Interestingly, a study published in JAMA in November 2020 reported that obstetrics and gynecology had the highest mean percentage of underrepresented applicants and matriculants among all surgical specialties. It is therefore important we take advantage of the diversity we are currently recruiting in our fields, and we should work towards increasing trainees' exposure to REI through pipeline programs and educational opportunities that I know my fellow panelists will discuss further. After falling in love with the field of REI during medical school, I questioned whether I could thrive in a white, male-dominated field. It was then I reached out to Dr. Tia Jackson Bay, who was an REI fellow at that time. She quickly became my mentor, and having a strong Black female physician who was incredibly passionate about reducing reproductive healthcare disparities made me even more compelled to pursue a career in REI. I remember seeing African American patients who, as we know, have demonstrated higher fertility rates and lower rates of utilization of reproductive services, feel very comfortable coming to Dr. Jackson Bay for their infertility care and subsequently refer other URM patients to her practice. As a first-generation Vietnamese American, one of my future goals is to work with Asian American REI patients. I have seen firsthand how cultural beliefs and cultural taboos affect seeking infertility treatment. For this reason, when I started residency, I began to seek an Asian American mentor, but it was very difficult to find someone that looked like me and shared similar experiences. I emailed at least a dozen REI practices, but I have come to realize it shouldn't be this hard to find a URM mentor. While I still have a long road to go before even applying to REI fellowship, I did want to talk about some of the microaggressions I've experienced as an Asian American female who has expressed interest in applying for REI fellowship. My entire life, I was constantly told, you're Asian, you're smart, you don't have to study or even try. Then a couple years ago, an REI fellow even said to me, even though REI is competitive, you're Asian, which means you're smart and don't need help applying for fellowship. Which, excuse me, I wouldn't say that I'm that smart. And I do need guidance and mentorship applying to REI. In addition, I've had colleagues also say to me, it's weird that you're so liberal. Do your strict Asian parents approve of your support for the advancement of reproductive medicine? That also wasn't cool. It's microaggressions like these that inhibit URMs from joining the REI field. In conclusion, I wanted to share a little bit of my story with the hopes of encouraging increased trainee exposure and mentorship in REI. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Simoni now to talk about the fellowship perspective.
Yes, sorry about that. Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas, for having me here tonight, and thank you for, and good evening, everybody. I am Michael Simoni, a second-year clinical fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and like Dr. Vu, I just want to give some experiences that I've had on my path to medicine in the field of REI. I'll break down some specific themes that I've noticed, starting with, let's see, first of all, our disclosures talking about that this is just a really our experience, but let's start with imposter syndrome. This is something that builds up over time, and it really could start way back in grade school. For me, I remember going to apply for colleges and someone telling me that I shouldn't even apply out of the States. So something like that could really impact someone, how someone thinks about, well, when I get to the next step, what if I have some self-doubt, or what if some instance thinks that I'm just not good enough for where I'm supposed to be? We experience microaggressions like this when people reference affirmative action or anything along those lines, and it really could take just one instance to spiral and for someone to have self-doubt. And so it all depends on really the coping mechanisms that someone may have and how they deal with when these issues arise. Also, there's discrimination that happens going all the way back when you're dealing with patients in the hospital and the staff in terms of who's helping you take care of them. This is also apparent in application processes that we have, and while companies and schools have done really good at looking at non-biased ways of selecting individuals to make sure they don't discriminate, you have to understand that just going through applications that maybe require some guidance, such as really large grants or really large academic sponsorships like Rhodes or something like that, can actually can be impacted by discrimination when people are just trying to go find some help on how to do something like that. I've been personally discriminated against on my appearance along the wards or in the hospitals. People telling me that I shouldn't wear my hair a certain way or wear jewelry a certain way. And then also language comes into play. If you think about just the upbringing that someone may have when they're coming from a different background. And of course, there is code switching, but for various reasons, the language that could slip up in, depending on where you're from, could actually have a bigger impact depending on how it's perceived. And that can happen definitely in when we're talking about this type of stuff. And another thing that I've noticed is when you're actually looking for help, you know, we've had many minorities such as myself who have had minimum exposure to medicine throughout before going to college and sometimes even before getting into med school. And so you have to understand that this minimum exposure, we may be shocked when we see upon things that maybe we just didn't think about we would be encountering along the wards or in our fields. And like Michelle was talking, Dr. Vu was talking about, these URM mentors are really hard to come by. And I've actually also utilized help from other mentors to help me find them. It's how I got connected to Dr. Thomas, for example. So something I want to talk about also is these DEI initiatives that have been creeping up especially over the past year. And while they are awesome, there are things to think about in the background and just making sure that you're aware of them when you're maybe conducting them in your own practices or institutions where you're from. So this increase in DEI awareness has been going on in academia and the community, and it's led to an increase in requests to appear on committees and teams, and as appropriately so, because we want to hear the perspective of these underrepresented populations. Now this takes a toll on the people who are in these committees and teams, because this is a less population of less numbers of people, and so we're getting spread out. And if we don't have help, you know, it could lead to some mental exhaustion. I've personally been on a committee for something in the past year where, you know, people were really gung-ho about doing some community service, and then when it came down to actually signing up for it, out of 40 people, really only 2 registered, and it was just kind of a downer and can really have a toll on, well, are people taking this seriously? And something else to think about is the time and effort that's taken away from academic initiatives, such as all these initiatives that have been going on recently. Are you going to give them the same recognition when people say, you know what, this is what I spent my time on? Maybe I didn't do research, maybe I didn't you know, find the next big thing, but you know, I really wanted to make a difference in the community. I really wanted to make a difference in the field of REI, and so would you think about that the same way? You know, as I talked about, there's been requests to appear on committees and teams. You know, it's great to see minorities such as myself giving these talks, but you know, we also want to see them talk about, you know, regular health things that we typically see the majority, you know, giving talks in. You know, trying to just recruit underrepresented minorities to talk about underrepresented minority issues. You know, we've heard that for a while, and so we'd like to see them now put in all of these public spaces where we could see them talk about their work, talk about other things that we normally don't get to see them talk about. And with that, I'll give it to Dr. Richard-Davis.
I did want to say a few things, about Dr. Gloria Richard-Davis. Her talk is going to be on the pipeline for URM physicians. Dr. Richard-Davis and I have known each other for a number of years, because when I was leaving Wayne State to go to Cincinnati, she was coming in as a fellow at Wayne State University. She's a tenured professor, board certified REI specialist, and serves as the director of the Division of Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. She's also the executive director of the UAMS Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, where she leads efforts to diversify the healthcare workforce. She founded the ASRM Health Disparities Special Interest Group in 2004 and continues to be very involved in health disparities research. She serves as the chair, subgroup 1 of the ASRM DEI task force, and she'll present that information as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. My pleasure to be here, and thank you guys for being in attendance. So my charge is really to talk about the workforce diversification that we really need to address in reproductive medicine. I want to acknowledge this amazing subcommittee group that I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Alvaro, Chang, Lansky, Darno, Middlebrook, Thornton. They were very passionate and very engaged in this whole process. So I wanted to spend a couple of seconds just recapping from webinar in February, where we talked about the initial efforts that we made. We were subcommittee 1, so charge 1. We were charged with enhancing opportunities to increase and support diversity, equity, and inclusion and I'll say URIM, so underrepresented minority in medicine, in profession and leadership roles in reproductive medicine. One of the things that we started talking about initially is really just doing an environmental scan, because like any other process, we think about doing research, you need to know the point from which you're starting. So that would be our baseline. And then expanding and focusing on recruitment, retention, and retention of a diverse workforce. To increase outreach, education, and opportunities for diverse populations, including our pipeline program, which I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about this evening. And then expanding and enhancing training to support diverse and informed workforce. You just heard from Dr. Simoni and Dr. Vu some of the challenges and some of the barriers that we really do need to address in our training areas. So the environmental scan that we initially focused on is a little bit more challenging than we think. When we looked at ASRM's demographic, the profiles that we create in our membership profile, only about 131 out of 8,000 members answered the question about race and ethnicity. So we still have to really kind of drill down and get additional information. There was a survey done by SREI in 2016, however, that did provide some data on demographics where we had, and we'll look at the data with regards to our residents and fellows, but in SERI membership, we had about 76% Caucasian, 6% Asian, 3% Black, and about 5% Hispanics. So we still have obviously a lot of work to do in that sense. We want to make sure that we're aligning all of our diversity initiatives with ASRM's mission, vision, and value, which, of course, as we know, is really to provide ethical and quality reproductive care for every person. So it shouldn't be hard to align it. This was an article in Academic Medicine, which I always kind of keep in the forefront of discussions, because it really does highlight some of the key things that are important in diversifying the workforce. First of all, is setting diversity as a priority. And I think ASRM has stepped up and done that by convening this task force. Seeking out candidates. You know, you can't find diversity if you're not looking for it, or if you're not looking in the right places. So we have to be a lot more intentional about the areas that we are recruiting individuals from. The process of seeking candidates also needs to be a holistic approach. So when we're talking about reviewing applications and the interview process, we have got to be inclusive. So implementing those inclusive recruitment process. Investing in trainee development. And, you know, the leadership of whether it's an organization or institution has to really be invested in changing the culture. When we talk about training development, it's allyship, it's bystander training. You heard Dr. Vu and Dr. Simoni talk about the paucity of underrepresented faculty. And so we can't do this work alone. We can't lift all of this. We need our allies and we need those individuals who are in the trenches with us to understand how important this is. It's important for our healthcare outcomes. It's not just about diversification of the workforce. It's looking downstream at what that does to improve our patient outcomes. And then lastly is building that pipeline where in order for us to increase diversity, we really have to start at a point further upstream so that we can, when it comes to residents or fellows, Dr. Vu mentioned OBGYN is one of the more diverse specialties, but I promise you, we still have a lot of room for improvement there too. So this is just a picture demonstrating all the leaks that we have along the pipeline, especially when we talk about URMs. We may start out with a pretty significant number who are majoring in pre-med, but you know, after that freshman, sophomore year, things get a little bit harder. They don't have the support. They start to drop off. We get to medical school, even further reduction or loss in our URM representation. Residency, now further upstream for our fellows, and leadership. We really have a lot of leaks that we need to plug in the pipeline. Our ACGME accredited program, we have 578 accredited programs in the United States, 288 OBGYN residencies, and our fellowships, we have 49 in the country that's accredited. So when we look at the data across the residency and the fellowship program, so in the top rung, I have the demographics of US population in parentheses up here. And that's just to kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about diversifying our workforce, because really the goal ideally would be reaching population equity. If we can't reach population equity, we certainly want to get close to it. And we want to make sure that the people who are in the decision-making positions are sensitive to this and focused on improving that. So 13% of Americans are Black. When we look at our OBGYN residency programs, 8% Black. When we further drill down to our fellowship, we drop down to 6.5%. The Latino Hispanic population, fastest growing population, minority population in the country, it's at 18%, 18.5%. For OBGYN residents, it's only 7%. And then in REI fellowship, we're now down to 3%. We definitely need to be intentional and focus on our American Indian and Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, 1.3%, 0.2%. While they're not a large portion of the demographics, it's still important that we have representation. And if you look at our fellowship programs, maybe that's changed. This was 2019 and 2020, but we had none. And that's just not acceptable. We have to be intentional in being inclusive in our recruitment process for fellows. And this is just, you know, a quick pie chart looking at what our OBGYN residency programs look like. So what are some of the barriers when we talk about diversifying the medical profession? Well, first is the medical school barrier. It costs. Medical school is expensive, and the average student graduates with over $200,000 of debt. But when you look at the individuals who are matriculating in our medical schools, only 5% of those medical students come from the lowest earning quartile. So again, there's not a lot of diversity there coming in the door. When we talk about the process of selecting medical students and once they're in the process of evaluating them, there are lots of biases that's built into the evaluations. We have a number of publications that talks about the medical student evaluations, comparing majority to URIM, and we know that the evaluations are less stellar, and they are typically lower in terms of what's written about our URM students. There's the bias in selecting AOA or humanism awards, which when you're talking about competitiveness for residency programs becomes really important. We also know that there are biases in the gatekeepers being our faculty, who are really majority. So when we look at the committees that we put together, whether it's the interviewing committee, the admission committee, we really need to be intentional about diversifying those committees. And more recently, we have added implicit awareness training to all of our committees, certainly the admission committee and other key committees. And I have to commend ABOG, because several years ago, ABOG included that in our board examiners training. The Residence Review Committee published this article, and they really did a stellar job. It was a group at one of the ACGME meetings who convened, and they did something that's called like a UN table, so to speak, where they created these questions specifically addressing diversity. And this was not just URM, this is residents that have been selected. So the majority of them were from the majority group. But what they did was they looked at what are the barriers in terms of what we see in residency programs that's keeping URMs from either getting into residency programs or being successful in those programs. And certainly the first step is scores, right? Board scores. Step 1 has gone to a pass-fail, which is great, but step 2 is still scored. So that's a gate, that's a barrier. There's the microaggression and systemic racism. That's baked into our systems. And so they talk about in their environment, these are things that they've seen. The minority tax, Dr. Simoni mentioned, you know, when you are URM in any environment, you can't speak for the whole group, but somehow we're expected to represent the whole group because somebody has to be at the table. There is more dismissal of URMs from residency program. ACGME has some data, which I'll share with you, that is actually quite disconcerting. And then they talked about improving relationship among team members. And we see it all the time, the dynamics between teams where there may be some bullying. There needs to be more cultural competency training. And they specifically said, we're not talking about just modules. We're talking about actual practical experiences, whether it's role playing or other interactive ways in which we address those issues. Addressing tolerance and unacceptable behavior. And then one of the things that is a challenge for our URM students and residents is facing this discrimination in the workplace. They don't feel empowered to report it. So there's underreporting. They fear retaliation, not advancing, fear, shame. So we have to get past that in order for us to have some transparencies in our system. So some of the solutions that they recommended, which actually ACGME has already begun to incorporate. They talked about having a conference course and toolkits for educators to remediate and identify residents at risk. So before we lose them, what can we do to identify them and improve retention? Designated institution diversity officers. Many institutions across the country are starting to identify and designate diversity officers. The challenge there is there has to be academic credit given for this effort and that we actually do support the effort. And that's another challenging issue. But ACGME, including questions about diversity on the annual resident survey. I know that on our faculty survey this year, there were at least 5 or 6 very poignant questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of our recruitment, retention process across all stratas, from the students up to staff. And then ACGME should create a diversity committee, which they have done, and analyzing the national data to identify programs with problems. They are very actively involved in that process. So this is some of the data that I referenced earlier that is quite disconcerting and alarming in some cases. This was ACGME's data with looking at dismissal from residency programs across multiple specialties. And they highlighted some very key ones when we talk about, okay, so for general surgery, only 5% of residents are URMs, right? But if you look at the residents that are dismissed, 25.8% are Black, 12% Asian Pacific American, 6% Hispanic. We don't represent that much of the residency programs. And you can see that same pattern across almost all of the specialties. Here's OBGYN, right? I just showed you what percentages of our residents are Black and Hispanic, but yet the percentage of residents who are dismissed from the program, 20% Black, 20% Hispanic. That is unacceptable. And so what they're doing is they're drilling down and looking at how to make this process transparent in why these residents are being dismissed or not progressing. The pipeline, in order for us to grow the pipeline, we really have to talk about mentoring, coaching, sponsoring. And there are different relationships we have along the way. Certainly being a role model, you might look at Dr. Thomas and say, I want to be just like Mike. So we identify role models. Mentorship, we have a very robust system that we are setting up and hope to transfer this to ASRM platform, create something very similar with a virtual mentorship platform, because we are living in a virtual world and we're scattered around the country. So when Dr. Vu talked about not being able to find an Asian mentorship, if we've got a virtual platform, then it's not limited to the physical space in which she lives. We know it's important to coach along the way, and it's even more important to sponsor. Identify those URMs that you see has potential. You're supposed to see their potential in them when they don't even see it, and help to sponsor them along the way. Dr. Thomas talks about Dr. Rebar in that way quite often. So this is our virtual mentorship platform at UAMS that we launched January of this year. I spent about a year customizing this platform, and we created profiles for the faculty and students. And they're similar to LinkedIn profile, but obviously because we're talking about an academic institution, it's focused on academia. It's our academic experiences, our research experiences, so that the mentees can actually go to this social page and put in some keywords that would pop up from the profile description. So if you're looking for a researcher in granulosa cells, for example, you should be able to search it and find them. We created these communities, again, so that if you're trying to connect with people who have some common interest or commonality with you, when you belong to the same community, you're connected, and the platform helps to keep you connected to those individuals. There's a lot of features that's definitely a plus. So we're working on how we can actually bring a similar platform to ASRM for mentoring our residents and fellows. When we talk about the cultures in which we operate, though, it's critical that we really step back and look at our culture with an equity lens and create inclusive cultures. Culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. We've heard that over and over again. And so we have to be very aware and cognizant of what our cultures are and what we continue to allow or not. And so it starts from the top down, that we address things that are just not acceptable. Gender, race, equity should be a core value. We should have transparencies in our process. The idea is to create an equitable workplace for all and a just culture. You know, there is a lot of discussion about the social inequities across the country. Well, a lot of that is also embedded in our medical systems. So we really should own it and address it. Listen to your URM providers, residents, fellows, what their experience is. You just heard from two of our resident and fellow talking about their experiences. And recognize words and pictures matter, what we say. The media does a lot to harm images and stereotype individuals. So recognize your own biases in that, because we've been exposed to that. Whether you're a URM or you're a majority individual, you're still exposed to those same stereotypic images. And it affects the way that we even view the groups that we belong to. There are lots of diversity tools that can be applied. Harvard has the implicit bias association test, which is pretty widely used. AAMC, Diversity Engagement Survey. There is a really robust MedEd portal, which has an anti-racism menu of things, workshops that you can employ and implement in your organizations. We've done across our enterprise inclusive excellence training, which again starts to drill deeper down into biases and creating those communities of inclusivity. Health equity certification, I just completed through Cambridge. And then there's certification in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's no paucity of tools and training opportunities, so that if you're not well versed in this, you can certainly avail yourselves of some of these opportunities in terms of training. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Richard-Davis. Our next speaker is Dr. T. Arthur Chang. He is also going to talk about the pipeline, but this time about URM lab personnel as part of the pipeline. Dr. Chang is a professor in the Division of Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility in the Department of OBGYN at the University of Texas Health Science Center, and the director of the Clinical Associated Reproductive Technology Laboratories at UT San Antonio. He's been very active in clinical laboratory research, teaching, and quality management. Dr. Chang is a member of ASRM DEI Task Force and also served on numerous leadership and committee positions, including ASRM, SART, SRBT, and AAB-CRB. Dr. Chang.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss the pipeline for URM lab personnel. Slide. So as Dr. Richard-Davis mentioned, so one of the task force charges is increase outreach, education, and opportunities for diverse populations, including pipeline programs. And as Dr. Vu mentioned, for the OB-GYN residents and also medical students, the REI is like a less discussed compared to other like specialties. And even so for the lab people. So most people, I believe that most people we know probably have no idea about the IVF lab, the andrology lab, embryology lab, endocrinology lab related to ART. So that's the biggest challenge for the pipeline we're going to establish. So a few years ago, this is a research done by the Duke University. So back in 2016, so 18% of college degrees in the US were awarded in STEM fields. So 12% for Black students and 15% for Hispanic students. So there's a gap, and not a huge gap. And however, what we have seen in the field of the ART labs is we see like a much lower percentage of Black and Hispanic like employees, technicians, and also the directors. And also between the 1999 to 2012, 72% of NIH awards were given to white scientists, and 2.4% of these awards were given to Black scientists. So that's also like affecting the research in the ART as well. Although some of the ART research are not like NIH funded, however, it's the overall like a demographic which impact the research. And there's a huge need to increase outreach and pipeline programs to address such a gap. And also we need more data on our profession to investigate the diversity status and identify issues in our ART clinical lab and research communities, and also explore potential solutions. So to be honest, we don't even have a demographic data on the ethnicity of our professions in the ART clinical laboratories. So that could be one thing we can start working on. And many professional societies and associations understand the importance of diversity and inclusion. However, they may not have the formal mechanisms as well as the data sets to address the relevant topics, such as promoting URM students and their URM members. And those three societies are the major reproductive technology laboratory professional groups. The first is the Society of Reproductive Biologists and Technologists, SRBT. So it's an affiliated society with ASRM. And the second society is the American Association of Bioanalysts and College of Reproductive Biology, the ABCRB, as well as the board to certify the lab people, as the ABB. And the third group, the major group, also including the biggest group of basic researchers, is the SSR, Society for the Study of Reproduction. And all those programs, they understand the importance of diversity and working very hard to promote leadership development and increase the pipeline. However, oftentimes we don't even know where the pipeline program come from, where the resource will come from. So the ideal goal would be recruit the junior lab staff and new members, and also mentor them and cultivate them into senior, like managerial senior positions and leadership positions. And also they can serve as role models, just like Dr. Richard-Davis mentioned. The role models can bring up another generation of the people interested in this field. And also pathways to lab directorship in the clinical lab. When we talk about increasing pipeline, so the mentorship and programs are very important. Most people, they got exposed to our profession through our various different stages. For example, like on-the-job training, those people, they are recruited, even some of them, they have no idea what the andrology or embryology lab look like, but they were referred and they joined the lab, and gradually some of them, they really love it, they stayed. Some people get exposure during the graduate school. Maybe they are doing the embryology research or relevant research in stem cells. And some of the students, they went through the college internship or the programs in, for example, like a College of Agriculture, they have animal science, or some people went through the medical technology programs. And very few people would learn about the fertility professions and also the lab professions during the high school and middle school. However, that would be a goal we can actually expand and look for the pipeline recruitment. So what are the strategies we can utilize? This is a big question and we can keep brainstorming on this. I want to talk about the academic background and training of the lab professionals. In most cases, we have people coming from those different fields. The first is animal science and agriculture. Throughout the country, the programs in animal science and agriculture, they offer courses and internship opportunities, specifically about the reproduction and breeding in farm animals. And oftentimes those knowledge and practice can be applied to human as well. However, in many schools, the animal science and agricultural departments, they consist mainly of the non-minority students. And second major resource of the lab personnel is the biology as well as biomedical sciences. Students majoring in these degrees, usually they are not exposed to clinical ART lab career option. They usually focus on more like basic research or like pharmaceutical, those industry. There's no specific learning about reproductive management as well. The third group of the lab personnel resource is medical lab sciences. In the old days, we call that the clinical lab sciences or like the medical technology. So most of the CLS and MT training programs, they focus on the like pathological testing of diagnostic lab medicine. And I'm not aware of any like MLS program in this country really providing the formal module or courses in reproductive lab technology. That's another option and direction we can focus on. And many people, once they understand the importance and the career potential in the clinical lab, they will join the lab or they will enroll into those master or PhD programs in clinical ART. For example, like EVMS, there's a master program which is well known from Colorado State University, as well as programs in United Kingdom and Europe. So students in those programs, they are already aware of clinical ART careers, or many of them, they already working in this field. So it's not a pipeline issue per se. However, how do we encourage more URM students to apply into those programs could be a key. So the strategies we could consider is starting early and engaging frequently. The first, participate in high school career festivals could be an option. Most students don't know this job exists. So early exposure to the field is very critical. But most people, unless they know someone personally going through fertility treatment or working in the reproductive technology lab or this industry, they don't think about careers in reproductive technology. And those they think about this don't think past the fertility doctor's career. And we can discuss with counselors, college advisors, high school advisors, and career advisors. So there's a high chance that most of those counselors and advisors even don't know about this field either. And also we can consider the ASRM to develop brochure or web page targeting the young people, those future reproductive scientists. Like starting in high school or college, we can provide some online resource for them to get exposure. So we build up those early exposures. And also we could consider joint efforts with other societies like AAB, CRB, and SSR to develop college pipeline programs. For example, the SSR has a strong presence in college, especially in the agriculture and animal science programs. However, very few of those programs, they will have efforts to address the clinical lab, the needs of the talents in this field. We could deliver guest lectures. We could recruit like local fertility clinics to advocate and connect with local schools, high schools, colleges, or we can even consider sponsoring a short-term internship, for example. And also we can start on the URM students, especially school districts, which have the majority of students are URM students. So this is the discussion on the lab part.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang. Really appreciate it. Great talk. Next speaker that's rounding us out is Dr. Christopher Herndon. He's going to speak on enhancing mentorship and support. Dr. Herndon is an assistant professor and medical director in the Division of Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility in the Department of OBGYN at the University of Washington. He's a past chair of the ASRM Access to Care Special Interest Group and involved in local, state, and national initiatives to improve access to care. Dr. Herndon received his medical degree from Yale University, residency training at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital, and did his fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco with my good friend and former partner, Dr. Marcel Cedars. Dr. Herndon, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for your introduction. I have no disclosures. Mentorship is essential for success, for career choice, for guidance, for personal and professional development at all stages. Studies have clearly shown that mentorship enhances productivity and advancement. There is a strong correlation between mentoring support and mentee confidence and career satisfaction. There is an inverse relationship between receiving mentorship and dropout and burnout. Mentorship is a catalyst for career success, the importance of which is, generally speaking, often undervalued, particularly by individuals early in their early career stages. There is not a single best approach to mentorship. There are different models for mentors, and mentors can serve different roles. Strauss and colleagues surveyed both successful and failed mentoring relationships at 2 academic medical centers. The characteristics of successful mentoring relationships included reciprocity, mutual respect, clear expectations, personal connection, and shared values. Failed mentoring relationships were characterized by poor communication, lack of commitment, personality differences, perceived or real competition, conflicts of interest, and the mentor's lack of clinical experience. The majority of faculty in U.S. medical schools report mentoring to be infrequent or inadequate. This is particularly magnified for underrepresented minorities who receive less mentoring than their non-minority peers. Underrepresented minorities face considerable barriers with which our speakers, our panel spoke today, including discrimination, lack of support, and lack of cultural representation. These barriers are always present throughout early education, in the course of professional training, and persist in all stages of career development. There is a critical and today unmet need to expand diversity in the workforce to reflect the growing population of the U.S., the growing diversity of the U.S. population. As Dr. Richard-Davis nicely articulated, diversity in the medical workforce has been demonstrated to improve healthcare quality and outcomes, access to care. It's important for education, and it's important to our patients. Underrepresented minority mentors provide unique guidance for URM mentees due to shared life experience. In one survey of medical residents of diverse backgrounds, residents preferred mentors they selected rather than ones that were assigned to them. Further, URM residents reported actively seeking out mentors of the same race and ethnicity and gender, but expressed difficulty in finding such mentors. There is a critical need for programs to address unique challenges faced by underrepresented minorities that include, as Dr. Vu and Dr. Simoni spoke about, marginalization, overt and covert racism and bias, racial fatigue resulting from the effects of chronic and insidious racism, allocation or overextension of work efforts that may not be prioritized or translate into career advancement. Examples cited in studies include service and mentorship and on institutional DEI committees, or broadly in institutional efforts to improve DEI that are not considered or weighed in criteria for promotion and career advancement. URM health professionals often treat more financially marginalized patients that generate less revenue, but whose clinical care requires more time. Others have commented that adversity itself can generate a self-reliance that is a successful coping strategy during medical and graduate school, but paradoxically, the same coping strategies that were successful in early training may later serve to isolate and hinder further success. Mentorship is widely considered to be the most important professional relationship for career development, but mentorship alone is not enough. I want to make the distinction here, that, as did Dr. Richard-Davis, between mentorship and sponsorship. The latter, which is defined as putting forward someone appropriately placed in the organization who has significant influence on the decision-making process or structures and who is advocating for, protecting, and fighting for the career advancement of an individual. Paired with mentorship, sponsorship is critical for advancement. Enhancing URM representation requires a multifold strategy and includes, among other considerations, promoting recruitment and pipeline opportunities, as our speakers have spoke with today, creating a conducive environment for support of underrepresented minority trainees, faculty, and professionals, and providing mentorship and support.
I think we had a very nice and robust discussion by all our panel members. And I guess as we were waiting for others to chime in, I guess I will ask the first question. Dr. Vu and Dr. Simoni, Dr. Vu first, can sort of give me your reasons for going into REI versus any other profession, the reasons that you have, that you focus, at least Dr. Vu, the reasons why you want to go into REI, and Dr. Simoni, why you decided to go into REI, knowing all the things that you know. Dr. Vu, do you want to answer that question first?
Yes, I can go first. I'm hoping to go into REI, but it's one of my goals. I think I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier when I was talking, but one of my biggest goals is definitely, I have, in my Vietnamese American community, I see a lot of the reasons why they don't want to seek infertility care and why it's taboo to talk about infertility. And I kind of want to break that barrier and serve those patients in the REI community, along with many other things, but I think that's one of my driving factors.
Dr. Simoni?
Yeah, I think the things that jump off right in my mind right away are the fact that it's procedural and the fact that the science is so interesting. But I think most importantly, what in the field attracted me was the fact that it's so easy and satisfying to have such an impact on a patient's happiness. I think, wherever they come from, whatever they've been going through, they've been trying really hard potentially to get pregnant, and it's something that we can help them out with, and we have some good tools in our toolbox to help them out with, and that's something I really appreciate about the field.
All right, Dr. Richard-Davis, are there any barriers to minority or underrepresented minorities in REI? Are there barriers either to get in, and are there barriers to stay in?
There are definitely barriers to getting in. We talked about, all the barriers starting from the step exams for residency and for application to REI. Then we're talking about research, publications, mentorship that helps you to navigate that whole process, people who sponsor and write letters for you. So it's not easy for URMs or for residents who are in programs that don't have REI fellowships to access individuals like that. And that's one of the things that we hope to bridge virtually by the platform that we're proposing to put together. Once you are an REI practicing, there are still barriers. You know, when we talk about the low representation of URIM in this field, you don't have the same presence when you're talking about leadership, decision makers at the table. And so that affects our ability to be effective and to affect change within our profession.
And the next question I'm going to direct toward Dr. Herndon. He's been very involved in access to care. The question is, what do you see as the barriers for non-white patients that need fertility care, Dr. Herndon?
There are many barriers for many individuals in the country. Cost, geography, a lot of barriers. But particularly if we look at even in states that have insurance mandated coverage, which address some but not all of the financial barriers, utilization is lower among minority populations, and there's many contributory reasons to that. Is trust, history of mistrust in medical cultures, lack of limited number of providers that are underrepresented minorities, accessing the communities. And so there's in outreach to improve access to care, it has to be a multifold strategy to really improve access to care and utilization in those populations and improve outcomes, because looking at the outcomes from the IVF or other fertility treatments, they're consistently lower in many minority groups. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand the reasons for this and to improve the outcomes.
The last question is going to go to Dr. Chang. Dr. Chang, what can we do to truly increase the number of underrepresented minorities in the laboratory? That seems to be the next frontier in our profession, is to increase the number of people of color in the laboratory setting.
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the lab community is like a big family. We welcome everybody coming into this field. However, I kind of feel like we don't really actively recruit people from the outside. We usually pick up people who just step in the door, maybe accidentally come into this field. So I think the college would be the key, because there are so many college students, they major in STEM, and as I presented, like about 12 to 15% of the Black and Hispanic students. So the gap is not huge. However, how do we recruit those people into our field? Maybe we could do, like I mentioned, like an internship, or we can do like a brochure. We can deliver guest lectures. Yeah, oftentimes we just need to go there and just raise the interest from the students, make them learn about this profession.
Well, I have been very, very honored to work with all of you. This has been a great seminar. I'd like to thank our ASRM, of course, but also thank today our speakers, Dr. Michelle Vu, Dr. Michael Simoni, Dr. Christopher Herndon, Dr. Gloria Richard-Davis, and Dr. T. Arthur Chang. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for moderating such a fantastic and important session. And to our panelists, thank you for bringing such an important topic up for discussion. To our attendees, thank you for joining us. This session was recorded and will be available on our website in the near future. Please watch your email for notification about future webinars. And for any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at webinars@asrm.org. This concludes the webinar.